Welcome back to another Read Aloud. I am your lovely host, Miss Disney, and we're going to continue with reading a Twisted Tale anthology. In this reading, we are going to be reading The Envelope. What if Anastasia had a change of heart? Written by Jen Calonita. Had the house always been this still? Anastasia contemplated this as she sat in the dimly lit parlor and tried to learn how to knit. It wasn't going well. But then again, neither had starting a fire. Hers died out within an hour. Too bad there was no one around to ask for a tutorial. In the weeks following the incident, Anastasia became the only one who bothered to get out of bed. Drusilla and Mother spent their days under thick quilts in bed, with the curtains drawn, their only company being an occasional visit from an on-the-mend Lucifer, who was still hobbling around after his fall. The three Tremaine women didn't converse with one another. They barely uttered a sound. The ticking of the clock was the only indication that time still trudged on without them. With Cinderella gone, there was no one to shout at to make the fire, fix their breakfast, wash the dishes, do the mending. The bells they'd once rung for service sat collecting dust. Even the home's pesky rodent problem had been solved. The moment Cinderella left, they did too. The Tremaine women were living like ghosts, and she was the only specter up and about, attempting to keep things running. Attempting was the operative word. "Mother," Anastasia asked that morning, "shall we have a music lesson today?" "Why would we? There's no one to impress." The whites of Mother's eyes were the only thing visible in the dark room. "No one will ask for your hand now." "You don't know that," Anastasia attempted being optimistic, which felt like trying on a new hat. A little uncomfortable, but something she wanted to get used to. What other choice did they have? In time, people will forget what happened with Cinderella and "Don't say her name!" Mother shouted so fiercely the windows rattled. Anastasia backed out of the room, shaking. She didn't have better luck with her sister. "Get dressed? Why?" Drusilla moaned, the top of her dark hair sticking out of a tangle of pillows that had a faint odor. "No one will ever set foot in this house again." Her sister was right, of course, and it was easy to be bitter. In the days following the incident, their mother had tried to tell the world their side of the story, but it was clear from the whispers she heard through friends and in the village that people had already formed an opinion. They loved a good transformation story, and Cinderella had risen from the ashes to win the heart of the prince after enduring years of abuse from a cruel stepmother and stepsisters, who treated her like hired help, so they said. All anyone could talk about was Lady Tremaine locking Cinderella up to keep her beauty hidden from the Duke and his footmen. But the glass slipper had inexplicably turned out to be Cinderella's. And when she escaped, what had happened at the Tremaine house was revealed by the Grand Duke. The Tremaines were shunned because of it. Being angry at herself, Cinderella, at her mother and sister, worked at first, but Anastasia quickly realized it wouldn't fix things. Invitations to events in society had ceased. The house was cold because Anastasia couldn't keep the fire going. The air was stale thanks to windows that hadn't been opened, and dust piled up on windowsills like a first snow. How had Cinderella kept up with all these chores? Cinderella's and Mother's doors stayed firmly closed, and Anastasia was left alone, trying to pick up the pieces of their lives to no avail. Visitors were non-existent, which was why the knock at the door that came that afternoon sounded so foreign. Who would bother calling on the Tremaines? Anastasia certainly didn't expect to find a handsome gentleman at their door. "Hello, miss." The young man's face broke into a smile at the sight of her. It was one of the prince's footmen. Judging by his livery, which included a blue velvet jacket with the royal family's emblem over a gold vest, he was so tall that his white stockings seemed to go on for miles, and he had shortly cropped brown hair and dark eyes that were two different colors, one gray, one green. How unusual! But it was the sight of an actual smile that stopped Anastasia in her tracks. "Your Grace." Anastasia grabbed the folds of her eggplant-colored gown and dipped into a curtsy without even thinking. If there was one thing Mother had instilled in her girls, it was proper etiquette. She was just thankful that, unlike her mother and sister, she still bothered with her appearance. "How can I help you, Mr.?" The footman blinked in surprise, showing off his long eyelashes. "Oh, it's Benoit, miss. Please call me Benoit." "A first name, no less. Nice to make your acquaintance, Benoit," Anastasia said, her own voice sounding foreign on her lips. She spoke so rarely now. She could hear the rasp as if she were waking from a long slumber. "I am Anastasia. Tremaine, I presume?" he said. Anastasia felt her stomach tighten. "Yes." He pulled his right arm from behind his back and offered her a crisp white envelope. "This is for you." Anastasia blinked in surprise. The envelope had the name Tremaine handwritten on it in familiar script. What was this? An angry letter from a mob come to burn their home down for what they've done? She had that nightmare more than once the past few weeks. Anastasia peered out beyond Benoit to the tree line, looking for axes and torches in broad daylight. She saw none. Still, she did not reach for the envelope. Benoit stared at her, confused. "This is for your family, from the future princess." Anastasia faltered. This was even worse than she had suspected. Could Cinderella be laying claim to their house? Technically it was hers. Were they being tossed out on the cobblestone streets? Benoit waved the invitation like a fan. "I promise the envelope won't bite. Or maybe it will. A biting envelope. Now that would be an exciting development in this saga, don't you think?" He smiled wider. This saga. He knew what her family had done. Her heart hardened once more. "Do you think I'm a fool?" she demanded. Benoit blinked. "Miss, why are you being so nice to me? You clearly know what is being said about my family, and yet you stand here acting like a jester, talking about biting envelopes instead of spitting in my face like some have done before." She closed her eyes at the memory of the last time she was in the village. Mother had been begging for bread, and much as Anastasia tried, the loaves she attempted to bake kept burning. Counting the few coins she could find in the house, Anastasia made her way to the bakery, reveling in the freedom she felt at being outside again. But the moment she stepped up to the counter to order, she knew it had been a mistake. Monsieur Gagnon spit at her when she asked for a loaf. Then the others in line did the same. Remembering her shame, Anastasia moved to shut the door in Benoit's face. Benoit boldly put his hand on the door to stop her. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to make you feel foolish." "Then why exchange pleasantries when you clearly know who I am and what I have done?" Anastasia heard her voice waver. "I was trying to be kind." Benoit cast his eyes downward. "I've been where you are before." Anastasia paused. "How so?" He stared at her again. His one green eye so striking, Anastasia couldn't look away. "My father. He got into some trouble a few years ago and muddied our family name. We couldn't show our faces in the village. It was a very lonely time. The clock seemed to move so slowly. Yes, as if the second hand has stopped completely. Anastasia whispered, holding on to the door for support. Her hand was so close to his now. All she would have had to do was reach out to touch it. She didn't. Benoit swallowed hard. So you can see why I volunteered to come today. He shifted slightly. Others refused. But I know what it's like to be made an outcast. I wanted you to know it doesn't have to be forever. At this, Anastasia hissed, the bitterness taking hold again. So you can see my future, Benoit? No. But I speak from experience. His voice was rushed. When I came of age, I was certain there was no way I could ever find employment, let alone in the royal household. My father said I was a fool to try applying. But the prince saw me differently. He smiled softly. He believes in second chances, and so I try to do the same. We are more than our mistakes. He held out the letter again. It's clear the future princess agrees. This is an invitation to the royal wedding. She asked that I see to it her family receive one. Her family? Meaning us? Anastasia couldn't believe what she was hearing. Benoit smiled coyly. Unless there is another Tremaine family in the village I don't know about. If so, then I must get going and find them. He pulled a gold pocket watch out and looked at the time. I have several invitations to make for the prince and princess before sundown. Anastasia wasn't sure how to respond, but she... It wasn't just her voice shaking now, it was her whole body. She'd spent the past few weeks angry with Cinderella, and here the girl was again, one-upping her with forgiveness. It was unfathomable. After all that had happened, how could Cinderella still consider them family? It suddenly occurred to Anastasia, shamefully, that Cinderella was good in a way she would never be. But if Cinderella wanted them at her wedding, then perhaps Benoit was right. She could be more than her mistakes. He'd found his second chance. Was it possible she could have one too? The thought filled her with hope. With trembling hands, she reached out for the invitation. Someone snatched it away first. Anastasia whirled around in surprise. Her mother was standing on their doorstep in her nightdress, her hair untamed, dark circles visible on her pale face. Under normal circumstances, Anastasia would have told her mother to hurry back inside. Appearing unkempt was not the Tremaine way. But her mother's eyes were wild, and these were not normal circumstances. "What are you doing?" Mother rasped. Anastasia attempted to calm her down. "Mother, it's all right." She looked from Benoit to Mother, her face flaming with embarrassment. "Cinderella has sent us an invitation to her wedding." The mother waved the envelope in Benoit's face. "Is that so? The girl wants to rub our noses in her triumph? Well, I won't allow it." She ripped the envelope in half and then in half again. "Mother, no!" Anastasia dropped to her knees to catch the falling pieces of paper. But several had already caught on the wind and began flying away. "Leave our home at once," Mother shouted at Benoit. "You tell the girl we are not her family." "Mother!" Anastasia gasped. "We want nothing to do with her," Mother continued. "You hear me? Nothing!" Benoit stumbled backward in surprise, practically tripping off the steps as Mother yanked Anastasia inside and slammed the door. She was up the staircase before Anastasia could even catch her breath. Anastasia threw open the door again, desperate to apologize, to tell him Mother didn't speak for her, to beg him not to tell Cinderella such things, to thank him for being so kind and understanding. But by the time she made it to the steps, all that was left of Benoit was the dirt kicked up by his horses as he galloped away. Anastasia stood there for a moment, hot tears falling on her cheeks. Any fleeting bits of hope drifted away like the pieces of the invitation. Run away, a voice in her head suggested. But where would she go? Who would dare help a wicked stepsister, as she'd heard herself called? It was hopeless. Anastasia took a step backward and felt her slipper connect with something on the ground. She looked down. Benoit's pocket watch stared back at her. He must have dropped it in his haste to avoid Mother. Anastasia picked it up, then turned the timepiece over in her hands. She stared at the inscription on the back. For Benoit, always be true, Papa. Be true, Anastasia thought. That was something she had never been. Her thumb rubbed the edged lettering over a single word. Papa. She hadn't thought of her own father in a long time. I'll love you always, Strawberry. That was what he called her, his Strawberry. They'd grown the fruit on their old estate, and she ate them night and day till her lips were stained pink, which had always been her favorite color. He had died when she and Drusilla were young girls, but she could still picture herself sitting on his lap in front of the fire when he'd returned from a trip. He was the one who had taught her to read, always keeping a small berlingot hidden in his jacket pocket. The hard candy was a reward for getting through a tricky passage. The sweets had been their secret. Mother wouldn't have tolerated her girls eating anything between meals. But Father had been the one up for merry-making, for acting out a story, for seeing the bright spots in the world. Those bright spots were gone now, and he was gone too. Forget the stillness. Their home had become a tomb in which they all would rot. Father, she thought desperately, help us. She wasn't such a fool to believe he would answer. There was no such thing as fairy godmothers, or godfathers for that matter. She was on her own. Mother had never liked to speak of Father. To her, his death was a failure, something he had done to them. The same went for her stepfather, who had embraced her and Drusilla as his own. When he died, he was scorned too, as was his child. All she had to remember Father by were a few fading memories. If only she had something tangible of his, as Benoit had his father's pocket watch. Maybe such an item would give her hope. We are more than our mistakes, she repeated to herself. If a possession of Father's existed, there was only one place she'd find it, a place she never dared step. The tower, where they'd stored old things from their past life. That was Cinderella's dreary quarters. Then again, she was no longer there. Quietly, Anastasia ascended the stairs, tiptoeing past Mother's and Drusilla's rooms and taking the narrow steps that led to the dilapidated attic. Cinderella's perfectly made bed sat empty in the corner. The rest of the furnishings were sparse. An old dressing partition and a small table she remembered discarding that Cinderella apparently used for her water basin. Anastasia's face burned once more as she thought of her stepsister toiling away in this dismal space. Walking across the room, Anastasia spotted a door that led to the storage area. Inside, she found an equally tidy space. Cinderella had clearly left her mark on everything. Behind the racks of unworn dresses and coats, Anastasia found several boxes and trunks. As soon as she saw one marked FT for Francis Tremaine, she knew she'd found what she was looking for. A very rusty lock prevented her from throwing the top of the case open and diving in. Anastasia looked around for something to break the decaying metal with. Spotting a pair of black shoes, how ironic, Anastasia picked one up and began chipping away. Finally, the lock popped off. Anastasia sat down and sorted through his things, wondering why Mother had never shown this trunk to her. The contents were exactly as she expected: old coats, a hat, what looked like a baby's quilt, and a stack of books. She held one of the fraying, leather-bound books up in wonder. She remembered this. Father had read her fairy tales all the time. After he died, the books had disappeared. Mother wanted her girls to focus on more attractive hobbies, music and etiquette, not on something as useless as reading. Anastasia went to put the book back in the trunk when something fell out from between the pages. An envelope. This one very old. She picked it up and stiffened when she saw her father's handwriting. The note was addressed to her and Drizella. How had Mother missed this? Hand shaking, she tore it open and began to read. My dearest girls. In a neat, tight cursive that mirrored her own. He had taught her that too, of course. Anastasia read, her eyes dripping over words in excitement to see what he had written. I long for you and your sister to do things I never had time to do before I became ill. When I was a child in Lilith, I pretended to do so many things. Watch a sunrise from the bow of a ship, explore a cliff on horseback, swim in the shadow of a great waterfall. You and your sister can do these things. That is my great wish for you. To live and to find great love like I found with your mother. Above all else, I hope you remember what I have taught you, that showing kindness to others, even when it isn't returned, is the greatest gift you can give this world. Have faith, girls, and I know you will do great things. I will be looking down on your adventures from above and smiling with happiness. All my love, Father. Anastasia leaned against one of the trunks and let the letter flutter from her hands. It stared back at her from the floor, taunting her, making her question her every decision and action over the past few years. It also made her wonder how well she remembered Father. For a man dying, his letter was so full of life, something she clearly was not. She was a disappointment. She hadn't done any of the things he wanted her to do. She'd certainly never found great love. Mother wasn't concerned with such trivial things. She just wanted her girls to marry someone who would elevate their status. Was that how her parents' story had played out? Father hadn't been wealthy, clearly, and yet he and Mother had what he called a great love. Who was this man her mother had fallen in love with? She couldn't fathom how Father's cheery disposition matched up with Mother's grim one. But then again, maybe Mother hadn't always been that way. It made her wonder, had Mother changed when she lost not just one husband, but two? Anastasia sat in that attic, remembering till shadows danced on the walls. The years blurred together, the lessons from Mother mixing with the contrasting words from Father. If Father had still been alive, what advice would he give her now? It's too late to do better, to live differently. Be kind, she thought, like Cinderella. Her stepsister. A girl she had treated shamefully. Anastasia closed her eyes and thought of her father's words. I hope you remember what I have taught you, that showing kindness to others, even when it isn't returned, is the greatest gift you can give this world. That was what Cinderella had done for the Tremaines, and her kindness was certainly never returned. Anastasia thought back to the night of the ball, when she tore strips of fabric and beads from Cinderella's finished gown. one she'd sewn herself in whatever little time she had. She had been terribly cruel to the girl, who had no family to speak of but her stepmother and stepsisters. Oh, Cinderella, Anastasia thought, tears falling. I'm sorry. But what good was her regret now? Cinderella had risen above them, and Anastasia was the one left to tend the cinders. Gingerly, as if it were the finest china, Anastasia picked up the letter again and looked at her father's handwriting. It made her wonder who Francis Tremaine really was, aside from an excellent reader, writer, candy hoarder, and maker of dreams. Why don't you find out? A small voice inside her asked. Anastasia wasn't used to voices, especially ones that were cheery and filled with aspirations. But she knew she could not stand the chilly silence for much longer. So maybe that was why she chose to listen. Grasping the letter and rushing out of the attic with it, she yelled for Mother and Drizella to get up and join her in the sitting room, shouting so loud she could have woken the dead. Mother wasn't amused, and neither was Drizella, who looked more drawn than ever. Maybe a good adventure was just what they needed. Child, what is wrong with you? Mother huffed. I found a letter from Father, Anastasia exclaimed, and she saw her mother's eyes flicker. It was addressed to Drizella and me. Francis? Mother whispered. A look of sorrow mixed with longing crossed her face for a moment. These were emotions her mother didn't usually express. Then, just as quickly, her face went hollow once more. Drizella and me, Mother corrected, and I don't recall your father writing you a letter. He was too busy abandoning us, leaving me to fend for myself with two small girls. Abandoned? Mother, he died, Anastasia said gently. Her mother looked flustered, and her speech, for once, wasn't polished. He swore he'd never leave me. Never leave us, she said quietly. Instead, I found myself alone in a cruel world, and nothing had been the same since. Her tone sharpened. Where did you find that letter? Anastasia tried to imagine what it would have been like to be a mother with two young daughters in a fear of how they would make their way without any income, any real power. And then Mother had met Cinderella's father, and he died too. Her worst fears realized a second time. Was it any wonder she had hardened? I found it in his trunk. Father writes about us traveling, seeing the world together. Surprisingly, Mother and Drizella said nothing. They were listening to her for the first time in weeks. Anastasia kept going. I thought that might be the very thing we need to do right now after the incident. Get away from this house and everyone who knows us. Anastasia inhaled fast and went in for the kill. I know exactly how we could start our trip too, by visiting Father's old hometown. Lilith? Mother's laugh rang hollow, and Anastasia noticed the sadness in her eyes as she spoke. It's a hovel. Your father and I never told people where we were from. I hardly think he'd want us to pay it a visit. Never even heard of it, Drizella said with a yawn and turned back to her room. And I don't care to see it now. Who wants to go to Lilith when our beds are so inviting? Drizella, Anastasia said impatiently. We are wasting away in here. Don't you want an adventure? You are not adventuring anywhere, Mother said. We are not leaving this house until this all blows over. We certainly aren't going to embarrass ourselves by attending her wedding. Her name is Cinderella, Anastasia said, her voice shaking as emotions got the better of her. She didn't need to invite us, but she did so out of the kindness of her heart. Perhaps we should be there for her. I don't know what's gotten into you, Anastasia, but we cannot show our faces at that castle. Mother's voice grew quiet. I don't care if we were given an invitation. If people saw us there, what would they think of us? Her mother was embarrassed. Anastasia didn't blame her. But this was their chance to make things right. Cinderella wants us there, and I'm sure Father would think we should make the effort. We'll go together, and all will be fine, Anastasia said hopefully. Maybe this will be our chance to begin again. Her mother shook her head. Don't be a fool. Burn that letter. It's filling your head with nonsense. I don't want to hear another word about it. I'm not burning Father's last words. Anastasia hugged the letter to her chest. Do not open the front door again, Mother continued, and do not bother me with such trivial things. What I need right now is tea. Fetch me some. Lucifer meowed at her feet, his black tail swishing as he eyed Anastasia devilishly. With a bandage on his back left leg, he couldn't move fast these days. Mother usually yelled to Anastasia to carry the cat up and down the stairs. But the accident hadn't changed his personality. It was as if that cat could understand Mother and liked her best when she was being cruel. Anastasia, do you hear me? Mother repeated. But Mother, Anastasia started, feeling her resolve begin to wane. Mother turned back to her room. Your father had his head in the clouds, adventuring, as if any respectable person would waste time on such follies. What this family needs is money. Going to Lille would take the last of what we have. She slammed the door behind her. Anastasia looked over at Gisela, who was still standing in her darkened doorway. We could still go, the two of us, she said hopefully. We should learn more about where Father's from, don't you think? Women don't travel alone, Drusilla sniffed. We would need a proper companion. And who would be seen with us? Anastasia hadn't thought of that. Traveling with Mother was one thing, but journeying to a strange town as two unmarried women would not be the easiest of feats, especially without spending much. Still, she was willing to try. Something told her learning Father's story was the key to finding herself, not letting her mistakes be all there was to her story. If Father had been good and kind, maybe, just maybe, there was a chance she could be too. We will hire someone to take us. We could sell some of our things, our dresses. We have so many.